April 1943, the Strait of Sicily. The night is absolute black, a smothering blanket of low cloud and sea mist clinging to the Italian coastline. Below the clouds, the only illumination is the phosphorescent churn of a furious wake. The engines roar, a deep, uneven thunder that cuts through the salt air, vibrating through every plank and rivet of the speeding hull. This is a patrol boat, specifically a patrol torpedo boat, or PT boat. A 60-foot dagger of plywood, powered by 3 screaming 1,200 horsepower Packard engines. On its deck stand a dozen men, young, grim-faced, shivering not just from the cold spray, but from the sheer audacity of their mission. They are racing into the most heavily defended waters of the Axis supply route, armed with 4 torpedoes that represent the equivalent of their boat's cost and a few scatterings of machine guns. To the veterans of the Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, these American boats were a joke. Fragile, noisy, made of common wood, a splinter fleet they called them. Their great cruisers and destroyers, forged in steel and tested in the harsh waters of the Mediterranean, were the true masters here. The Allied strategic focus was always on massive battleships and vast convoys, the heavy hammer blows of conventional warfare. This was the profound irony of the Mediterranean campaign. What the Axis commanders dismissed as a mere annoyance, a noisy, disposable mosquito, was about to become the precise, unstoppable poison that would paralyze their supply lines, turn their coastal towns into isolated fortresses, and ultimately dictate the pace of the coming Allied invasion. They were looking for the grand naval assault. They didn't see the silent, stinging death coming from the shadows. The PT boat was born of necessity and a certain American brashness. After the humiliating losses at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy desperately needed fast, shallow-draft vessels capable of protecting the fragmented Pacific island chains. The result was a design driven by speed and surprise. Builders like Elko and Higgins crafted hulls not from steel, which was needed for larger warships, but from mahogany plywood, lightweight, tough, and fast to produce. The early performance was erratic. They were initially criticized as too wet, too noisy, and too lightly armed to survive a serious engagement. They were intended for the quiet patrolling of backwater bays, not for direct confrontation with hardened frontline destroyers. But the young officers who crewed them, men accustomed to the daredevil glamour of motorboats and yachts, saw the potential for a new kind of warfare. They saw in the PT boat an invitation to break the rules. In the Mediterranean, this invitation became a mandate. The Allied objective, following the victories in North Africa, was to strangle the supply lines running from the Italian mainland to their forces fighting in Tunisia and, later, preparing for the defense of Sicily. The routes hugging the Italian coastlines and crossing the narrow straits were teeming with German and Italian transport ships, tankers, freighters, troop transports, all protected by escorts of destroyers and corvettes. The first PT squadrons arrived not with fanfare, but in pieces, shipped overseas and reassembled in makeshift yards in North Africa. Their initial missions were tentative, feeling out the complex system of Axis coastal radar, searchlights, and listening posts. But then came the first strikes. One night off the coast near Bizerte, PT-201 and her sister boats encountered a convoy protected by a formidable Italian Speaker-class torpedo boat. The PTs didn't engage in a head-on gunfight, which would have been suicide. Instead, they used their one true advantage, blinding speed and the ability to disappear into the noise of the waves and the reflection of the shore. As a young lieutenant, Robert J.G. Bob Lusk later recalled in his log, "We closed the range at 40 knots. The spray was a solid sheet. You couldn't see the bow, only the faint shadow of the coastline. We launched the fish at under 1,000 yards and turned hard." They didn't know we were there until the explosion. The resulting blast tore the stern off the Italian vessel. The transport ships, suddenly unprotected and confused, scattered into the darkness, only to be found and picked off by the following waves of PTs. The reports filtering back to the Italian High Command were contradictory and deeply unsettling. Ships were sunk by an unseen force. No heavy gun flashes, no radar signatures of conventional warships. The crew reports spoke of swift, shadowy attackers, too fast to track, and a sound like 1,000 angry hornets. This was the strategic brilliance of the PT fleet in the Mediterranean. It forced the enemy to overreact. Citation, Italian naval commander, historical fiction based on accounts. They forced us to commit destroyers, large, valuable ships, to guard coastal barges, ships they could easily have destroyed with aircraft, but they didn't. They used these small craft, these wooden toys, and they made our large navy patrol every cove and every shadow, spreading us impossibly thin. The PTs began to act as a systemic irritant, not just sinking ships, but creating chaos and mistrust. An Italian crewman could no longer be certain that his routine coastal supply run was safe. The coastline, which should have been a barrier and a shield, became the greatest threat. The psychological warfare had begun. The American crews learned to use the darkness not as cover, but as a weapon. They would deliberately run close to shore, using the echo of the coastal mountains to mask the sound of their engines from enemy hydrophones, or run at low speed, listening for the deep thrum of a freighter's propeller. The stage was set for the true test of the PTs. The Allies were preparing for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. To succeed, the Axis must be starved of reinforcements and supplies. The PT boats, the forgotten splinter fleet, were given a clear, deadly mission: transform the calm, familiar waters of the Italian coast into a terrifying, unforgiving gauntlet of American speed and torpedo steel. They were about to prove that, in the most modern of wars, sometimes the smallest, fastest weapon is the one that inflicts the most debilitating wounds. If you want to follow the dramatic stories of technology, strategy, and human endurance that shaped the Second World War, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. In the next chapter, we dive into the PT's deadly technology and the psychological toll of fighting in the dark. To understand the PT boat's effectiveness, one must first look beneath its surface. The perception of it being a flimsy wooden toy was its greatest defense. It was a paradox of design. A high-speed craft meant to deliver the heavy punch of a battleship. The core technological marvel wasn't the hull, but the engine room. Each boat was driven by three massive Packard 4M 2500 V12 marine engines. Originally designed for motor torpedo boats and modified from aviation engines, these beasts generated 1,200 to 1,500 horsepower each. When all three were pushed to the limit, the boat could achieve speeds up to 41 knots, nearly 47 mph, a critical advantage against most heavily laden German and Italian transports, which often struggled to exceed 12 knots. The noise, however, was deafening and undeniable. The challenge for the crews was to mitigate the sound. They developed the idling technique, using only the center engine at a low throttle to sneak close to the target, reserving the flanking engines for the final thunderous sprint and getaway. The armaments were a study in brute force strapped to a delicate frame. The primary weapon was the Mark 8 or Mark 13 torpedo. These were serious, full-size torpedoes, often 21 inches in diameter and containing a warhead packed with hundreds of pounds of high explosive. The total weight of the four torpedoes often exceeded 8,000 pounds, a tremendous burden for a 60-foot wooden hull. It was this destructive weight, launched with split-second timing, that made the PT boat truly fearsome. The crews quickly codified a set of tactics that ran counter to all established naval doctrine. They had to be more pirate than sailor. The wolf pack tactic. PT boats rarely hunted alone. They operated in divisions of 4 or 5, attacking convoys from different angles simultaneously. The moment the enemy escorts focused their searchlights and guns on one boat, another was launching its torpedoes from the opposite shadow. This forced the enemy to divide their attention and their limited radar resources. The false target strategy. One PT boat would often act as a decoy, running close to the shore at full throttle, firing tracer rounds to draw the attention of the Italian coastal batteries. While the batteries focused on the decoy's noise and flashes, the other boats would slip past the flank, invisible in the resulting confusion. Quote, Lieutenant Commander Henry G. Doyle, Historical Report. The game was not about fighting, but about hitting and running. If we stayed to fight, we lost. Our plywood could stop nothing. We had to be gone before their first heavy shell hit the water, before their gunners could adjust their firing solutions. The best defense we had was the speed of those Packards. The Italian countermeasure was the motoscaffi antisommergibile mass boats, their own fast, light craft. While formidable, they were often slower and less robust than the American PTs, and their torpedo technology was frequently less reliable. This led to frantic, chaotic duels in the dark, where the difference between life and death was measured in fractions of a knot, and the ability to distinguish a PT from a wave-tossed log. For the Italian and German crews, a night encounter with a PT boat was an experience of pure psychological terror. Imagine being a lookout on a heavily laden tanker, sailing under absolute radio silence, with the knowledge that your cargo, tanks, fuel, ammunition, is vital for the front. The Mediterranean is dark, familiar, supposedly safe within the perimeter of your escort. Then the first hint, not a visual sighting, but a sound. A low, rhythmic growl, like a frustrated animal that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The searchlights sweep the water, catching only the whitecaps. Then the sudden cataclysmic burst of sound as the PT boat throttle up, the three Packards screaming in unison, a sound one German captain described as a demon ripping the fabric of the night. The boat appears for a terrifying, fleeting moment, a low-slung dark shape silhouetted by the enemy's own tracers, a flash of machine gun fire, and then the sound of the torpedoes being launched, a distinct, wet thwump, followed by the hiss of compressed air. And finally, the devastating confirmation, a column of water and fire that momentarily illuminates the entire night as the torpedo slams home. The attack is over in less than 90 seconds. The PT is already gone, swallowed by the darkness, leaving behind only the wreckage, the screams, and the crippling doubt in the minds of the survivors. Citation, German supply officer, captured after the war. The aircraft we could hear for miles, the destroyers we could see on radar. But these small boats, they were like ghosts. They could only be confirmed by the wake of their torpedoes. Every dark night became a nervous ordeal. We could not fight what we could not find. The PT boats were not just destroying tonnage, they were destroying the enemy's confidence in their own coastal waters. They established a nocturnal reign of terror that forced the Axis to either halt coastal shipments entirely after dark or risk their destruction. By exploiting a technological vulnerability, speed, and a human weakness, fear of the unknown, the Splinter Fleet effectively imposed a nightly naval blockade on the Italian coast, transforming the seemingly safe Mediterranean waters into the most dangerous front of the war. By the summer of 1943, the relentless PT boat operations had begun to pay massive strategic dividends, laying the critical groundwork for the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky. The primary objective before the invasion was to achieve total air superiority, but the second, equally vital task was to ensure that not a single German reinforcement, man, tank, or round of ammunition could reach the island once the landing began. The PT boats were tasked with executing the final decisive choke. The Strait of Messina, the narrow 7-mile passage separating the toe of Italy from Sicily, became the focal point. This choke point was the artery of the Axis war effort, but it was also defended by some of the most concentrated coastal artillery, radar, and anti-torpedo netting systems in Europe. This was not a backwater skirmish, this was a direct assault on the lion's throat. The American PT crews, hardened by months of relentless night raids, viewed the strait not as a barrier, but as a target-rich environment. They knew every radar blind spot, every change in the water current, and the predictable schedules of the heavily escorted ferries crossing the strait. The nights immediately preceding the July 10th invasion were a blur of torpedo runs and frantic gun battles. The PTs were ordered to make runs into the strait, often engaging targets within point-blank range of coastal batteries. Quote, Motor Machinist's Mate PT-109 crew member based on historical interview. It wasn't a patrol anymore, it was a race. We were racing against the tide, against the darkness, and against the Italian gunners who were waiting for us. You could smell the cordite, and the shells were hitting so close the spray felt like stones. The water was boiling with explosions, but we had to get the fish off. The PTs achieved a stunning, disproportionate success. They sank barges laden with crucial tanks, troop ferries carrying elite German infantry, and vital fuel tankers. Crucially, they succeeded in forcing the bulk of the Regia Marina destroyers and torpedo boats to concentrate their defense within the strait, drawing them away from the vulnerable invasion beaches further north. One notable action involved PT-218 and her division. Running a reconnaissance mission, they encountered a heavily armed supply ship guarded by 3 large Italian corvettes. Instead of retreating, the PTs executed a daring split attack. 2 boats drew fire from the corvettes, while the third, PT-218, sped directly at the supply ship under the cover of the confusion. She launched her torpedoes at near-suicide range. The transport vessel erupted in a spectacular inferno, effectively blocking part of the strait for hours and delaying a critical German counterattack force. The stress on the crews was immense. They were fighting one-sided battles in the dark, where a single hit from a 20mm shell could instantly turn their wooden boat into a blazing wreck. The exhaustion was chronic. A typical mission lasted 8 to 10 hours, always at night, always with maximum intensity. Their sleeping quarters were cramped, wet, and perpetually vibrating from the nearby docks. The perpetual darkness of their working lives warped their sense of time. When they saw the sun, it felt wrong, a reminder that they were meant to be resting, hiding. Citation: U.S. Navy Doctor's Report, Sicily Campaign. The psychological strain on the PT crews is characterized by chronic anxiety, auditory hallucination from the engine noise, and a state of hypervigilance. They live in a world of near-absolute darkness and deafening noise, resulting in a high rate of combat fatigue, sometimes referred to as PT fever. They have the mental stress of a bomber crew combined with the physical isolation of a submariner. Yet this small, select group of men developed an unparalleled bond. They had to trust their navigators implicitly, who were relying on dead reckoning, primitive radar, and the vague, dark contours of the enemy coast to guide them. Their survival depended on the motor machinist, who could keep those temperamental Packard engines running at maximum revolutions, and the gunner who could spot an enemy silhouette in the dark before being spotted himself. The effectiveness of the PT boats was not lost on the Allied High Command, but its full impact was felt in the Axis command centers. The sheer volume of material lost in the weeks before Husky was crippling. Statistics of loss, estimate pre-Husky. In the 6 weeks leading up to the Sicily invasion, PT boats, often working in concert with British MTBs, sank or damaged dozens of Axis transport ships, accounting for an estimated 60,000 to 80,000 tons of crucial supplies and countless troops. The Italian High Command was, as the documentary title suggests, stunned. They had focused their defensive resources on guarding against a major conventional naval engagement, a battle between large destroyers and cruisers. They had dismissed the wooden boats. The PT fleet proved that a small, persistent, technologically specialized force, applied with audacious tactics, could render a massive defensive apparatus useless. On July 10, 1943, when the Allied invasion fleets descended upon Sicily, the Axis defenses were starved of fuel, short on ammunition, and delayed in their deployment. The success of Operation Husky was bought, in large part, by the young men who had spent the preceding weeks racing at 40 knots through the blackness of the Strait of Messina, delivering the silent sting of their torpedoes. The sheer, undeniable success of the PT boats in the invasion of Sicily transformed their status. They were no longer the obscure splinter fleet. They were now a recognized deadly threat. But with recognition came adaptation. The Axis forces, realizing their disastrous error in underestimating the boats, began to change their tactics. The game of cat and mouse escalated into a deadly technological arms race. Technological countermeasures. 1. High-speed escorts. The Italian and German navies began dedicating faster, more agile escorts, specifically modified corvettes, armed with better radar and quick-firing anti-aircraft guns, like the formidable German V-boat designs, solely to hunt PT boats. 2. Infrared and listening posts. Coastal defenses increased the use of hydrophones and rudimentary infrared detection to listen for the distinctive roar of the Packard engines and spot their heat signature before they could get within torpedo range. 3. Mine warfare. The most dangerous countermeasure, laying vast fields of contact and acoustic mines in the known PT patrol zones, turning the Strait of Messina into a deadly maze. For the PT crews, this meant an immediate, terrifying shift in the odds. Their missions became exponentially more dangerous. They were no longer hunting unsuspecting prey. They were engaging prepared, determined predators. The PT boats were forced to evolve. The old aggressive, full-throttle attack was now too risky. Commanders began to emphasize concealment and the use of their own superior radar systems, the relatively advanced SCR-517, which allowed them to spot the enemy before the enemy could spot them. The PT boat's role expanded from pure anti-shipping to vital coastal reconnaissance and special operations. The small size, shallow draft and silent approach, using only the small auxiliary engine, made them ideal platforms for inserting and extracting commandos, intelligence officers and agents behind enemy lines. Missions with far more political and strategic risk than sinking a transport ship. One mission in particular exemplified this new role: the extraction of a downed OSS agent near the Italian mainland port of Bari. The PT boat, designated PT-171, crept toward the heavily mined shore, the crew using only oars and a hand compass, navigating by the sound of the surf. The tension was palpable. The smallest mistake, a cough, a dropped tool, the glint of metal, could trigger a firefight or a mine. The boat's crew had to hold their position for over 4 hours, floating silently in the shadow of a coastal cliff, waiting for the pre-arranged signal. They succeeded, bringing back not only the agent but also vital German troop disposition plans. Quote, PT-171 officer post-war interview. That was the toughest mission, not because of the shooting, but because of the silence. We were a boat built for speed and noise, and suddenly we had to become a ghost. Every wave that slapped the hull sounded like a gunshot. Your heart was beating so loud, you thought the Germans on the cliff could hear it. The sustained pressure from the PT boats, coupled with the land victories and overwhelming air superiority, played a decisive role in the collapse of the Italian government in September 1943 and the subsequent armistice. The PT fleet, having previously hunted the Italians, now had to deal with the immediate chaotic repercussions of the armistice. Suddenly their former enemies were officially co-belligerents. This led to incredible confusion and several tragic friendly fire incidents in the dark, where trust was a luxury no one could afford. More critically, the armistice created a vacuum. With the Regia Marina sidelined, the German Kriegsmarine immediately moved to occupy the major Italian ports and seize any available Italian vessels. This meant the PT boats were no longer fighting Italian sailors, but the formidable, highly professional German coastal defense units, often utilizing captured, better-armed Italian vessels. This was the ultimate test of the PT boat's technical superiority and the crew's ingenuity. The Germans brought ruthlessness and discipline to the defense of the supply routes. The PT crews had to be faster, smarter, and more daring than ever before. The war in the Mediterranean was changing from a large, sprawling campaign into a focused, brutal fight for every kilometer of coast. The PT boats, far from being sidelined by the massive Allied invasion fleet, were now seen as the specialized tool needed for the continuous grinding work of coastal interdiction. They had transformed from an untested experiment into an essential front-line weapon system, ready to tackle the greatest naval power in Europe. The ultimate challenge for the PT boats in the Mediterranean came with the Anzio landings in January 1944. Anzio was a tenuous, shallow foothold behind enemy lines, constantly under threat of being pushed back into the sea. Keeping the Anzio beachhead supplied and preventing the Germans from reinforcing their counterattack was a matter of life or death. The PT boats were tasked with controlling the coastal approaches to the Anzio and Nettuno harbors, where the supply ships were anchored. This required them to patrol directly in the shadow of the German-held coastline, constantly exposed to shore batteries and Luftwaffe air attacks. The most celebrated engagement during this period was the protection of a supply convoy against a determined assault by German E-boats, Schnellboote, and heavily armed trawlers. PT-203 and PT-210, running a late-night patrol, spotted the distinct silhouettes of the German attack force. The fight that ensued was a chaotic melee of gunfire, tracer rounds, and near misses. Unlike their earlier stealth attacks, this was a grinding close-quarters slugfest. The wooden boats were hammered by shells, but their speed and maneuverability proved vital. Quote Ensign James A. Miller, PT-203 log entry. The E-boats were fast, but we were faster. We crossed their wake, took heavy fire on the port side, and I swear I could feel the splinters flying. We emptied the 50 cal into the lead boat's wheelhouse and then launched the remaining fish on a desperate angle. We watched the explosion, a beautiful high pillar of smoke, and the rest of them turned tail, We had paid for ourselves that night. The engagement was a decisive victory, preventing the German attack force from reaching the vulnerable supply ships. It solidified the PT boat's status as a formidable anti-shipping and patrol craft. They had proven they could not only sting, but also stand and fight when cornered. By the end of the Mediterranean campaign, the PT boat fleet's overall contribution, though often overshadowed by larger naval operations, was undeniable. Tonnage sunk, damaged. PT boats accounted for hundreds of thousands of tons of Axis shipping, destroyed, crippled, or forced to turn back. Forced response. They forced the Axis to dedicate vast resources, thousands of men, scores of fast patrol boats, and significant coastal artillery, to defending coastal routes, diverting them from frontline battles. Technological validation. The campaign was a validation of the small, fast, technologically advanced attack vessel, influencing naval doctrine for decades to come. The PT boat was the epitome of America's emerging wartime industrial power. The ability to mass-produce these complex, high-horsepower wooden ships and continuously supply their specialized engines and torpedoes was a logistical feat that the Axis powers could never match. The PT boat was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of America's capacity to innovate and overwhelm. As the war moved north, the PT boats continued their invaluable work in the Adriatic and Ligurian seas, relentlessly attacking the German coastal convoys until the final collapse of the Third Reich. When the surrender finally came in May 1945, the splinter fleet quietly faded into history. Unlike battleships or aircraft carriers, the wooden PT boats were not retained as symbols of victory. Many were stripped of their valuable engines and sunk or burned, a humble, swift end for a weapon built for speed and destruction, yet their legacy endures in the men who sailed them. These crews, young, often rebellious, and exceptionally brave, pioneered a form of naval warfare defined by audacity, speed, and intelligence. They proved that in a war dominated by monolithic steel vessels, the decisive blow could be delivered by a small, agile vessel striking from the shadows. They transformed the quiet, familiar coastlines of Italy into the deadliest hunting ground in the Mediterranean. The Italian commanders who once dismissed them as toys were forced to reckon with them as a strategic nightmare. The PT boat was the silent sting that bled the Axis supply lines white, paving the way for the Allied victory and proving that sometimes the smallest boat carries the biggest punch. This is just one of the thousands of untold stories that determined the course of the Second World War. If you want to delve deeper into the technology, strategy, and sheer human drama of history, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss our next deep dive documentary.